Previously on The Revolution. Attempts to tax the American colonies set off violent uprisings.
The spirit is, there's a strategy at work here to gradually erode American liberties. If you let them do this, what will they try to do next?
3,000 miles away, Benjamin Franklin was the toast of London.
He's absolutely in his element. He raised these down as the happiest years of his life.
That is, until he was brought before the King's Council to answer for his country's sins.
Franklin stands stock still in this humiliating moment. Many people have dated that as the moment at which Franklin becomes a revolutionary.
Spring 1775. Bloodshed at Lexington and Concord has inflamed the colonies. The Continental Congress rushes back to Philadelphia to take up the growing conflict, as militia units from all over New England pour into Massachusetts to back up their neighbors.
And the militias are certain that they can defeat the British Army because they have this revolutionary fire and spirit. And they argue that one man with that sort of spirit is worth 100 British regulars.
One such man who comes to Massachusetts is a fearless officer from Connecticut. His name, Benedict Arnold, a man intent on doing great things in the coming war. Arnold has a bold military plan for the Patriot cause.
When Benedict Arnold marched into the New England camp outside Boston right after Lexington and Concord, he was spit and polish. And he made such a physical impression when he sat on a fine horse. He was literally a commanding figure. Men looked up to him.
Arnold has come by his regal bearing the hard way. Born into a life of privilege, his alcoholic father squandered the family's fortune, a traumatic turnabout that forced Benedict, at 13, to apprentice with an apothecary. At 15, he ran away to fight with the Connecticut militia in the French and Indian War. After the war, he overcame his lowly circumstances to achieve wealth and success in business. But the angry, resentful youth has grown into a bitter and arrogant man whose contempt for British rule has made him a militant patriot. Arnold convinces the Massachusetts Provincial Congress to send him on a mission that will grab personal glory for himself and desperately needed ammunition for the rebels, to capture the guns at Fort Ticonderoga, the massive but loosely guarded British garrison in the upper reaches of New York.
Fort Ticonderoga, people referred to it as the Gibraltar of North America. It was, by all standards, the most spectacular fortress in North America.
As Arnold sets out on his quest to capture the fort, he hears that another soon-to-be famous name is driven by the same idea. Ethan Allen, a hard-drinking, hard-living frontiersman from Connecticut, couldn't be more different from Benedict Arnold. Allen has been engaged by Connecticut's Congress to rally his personal militia for its own mission to Fort Ticonderoga. These are the notorious Green Mountain Boys, who have been fighting their own war of independence against New York settlers.
Ethan Allen, their colonel commandant, organized about 2,000 armed frontiersmen in what is now Vermont, who for 5 years had been fighting New Yorkers to keep them out of their farms, out of their new territory. And they were willing to fight for their land. And they could move very quickly.
The Green Mountain Boys jump at the opportunity to take on the British. Taking separate paths, Allen and Arnold, each with his own orders, head towards Fort Ticonderoga. Arnold is alone, expecting to recruit men along the way. Allen and his men are already preparing the attack. Their paths cross 30 miles from their target. Arnold presents Allen with his Massachusetts orders and assumes he will command the operation. Allen, full of swagger as always, all but laughs in Arnold's face.
These really are very vain, egotistical men, two strong personalities, very much interested in the accumulation of individual glory.
The Green Mountain Boys were personally loyal to Allen, which Benedict Arnold found out to his chagrin when he arrived and tried to take over the attack on Ticonderoga. And they put down their guns, and they said they were going to march home, that they would only fight for Ethan Allen.
Arnold grudgingly agrees to conduct the raid with these men, but finds himself relegated to second in command. It is a humiliating confrontation. In the pre-dawn hours of May 10th, 83 Green Mountain Boys and 50 Massachusetts militiamen sneak up on the British stronghold. The 50 sleeping redcoats inside have gone undisturbed in the wilderness for so long, they are totally unprepared for what's about to hit them. It's over in minutes. The British soldiers surrender without a fight. The fort's valuable artillery stores now belong to the rebels.
They essentially stole the fort from the British. They were able to essentially walk in a manner of speaking. The British really left the keys in the door to Fort Ticonderoga.
What happens next turns Arnold's stomach. Allen's men find 90 gallons of rum, go on a 3-day binge, and tear the place apart, leaving Arnold to mop up after them. But the worst insult comes when Allen writes to Arnold's superiors in the Massachusetts Congress. Allen brazenly takes complete credit for the operation. He keeps all the glory for himself and purposely makes no mention of his rival, Benedict Arnold. For Arnold, it's a wound more devastating than being shot.
For an officer's honor, public recognition was key. If you'd played an important role and you weren't mentioned, that was very disrespectful. So Arnold was justifiably offended.
The affront to his honor is the first of many slights that will dog Benedict Arnold throughout the war and ultimately drive him to infamy. In Philadelphia, the men of Continental Congress reconvene in the Pennsylvania State House, which will later be named Independence Hall. They greet the capture of Fort Ticonderoga with decidedly mixed feelings. Still hoping for peace, they have refrained up till now from authorizing offensive actions against the British.
The capture of Fort Ticonderoga catches the Continental Congress largely off guard. They had not anticipated this, they did not desire this, and it now has forced their hand. They know that a military response is inevitable, and they now must scramble to take action.
The time has come for the 13 colonies to become a united military as well as political force. It issues currency against future tax collections from the colonies to raise and supply an army. Their mission now is to conduct a war, even while searching for a way to avoid it.
We ought immediately to adopt the army as a continental army, take upon ourselves the pay, subsistence, clothing, armor, and munitions of the troops. John Adams.
Adams urges the immediate appointment of a commander to head up this new army. His Massachusetts colleague, John Hancock, a vain, ambitious man who has just been elected president of Congress, assumes he will be offered this even more important role. His friend Adams is about to nominate him, or so he thinks.
And that is a gentleman among us, and very well known to all of us. A gentleman whose skill and experience as an officer, whose independent fortune, great talents, and excellent universal character would command the approbation of all the colonies better than any other person in the Union. That is the gentleman from Virginia.
Hancock is stunned. Adams passes him over for a gentleman planter from Virginia, George Washington.
The Continental Congress wanted a national army, not just a Massachusetts army or a New England army. They thought that by getting a commander-in-chief from a different colony would balance that. So they cast a welcome eye on Washington from Virginia.
At 6 feet 2 inches and 215 pounds, George Washington cuts an imposing figure. Prior to his nomination, he spoke very little in session, yet spoke volumes about his intentions by showing up every day dressed in a military uniform.
Well, here's a very impressive guy. He wears this military uniform with great dignity, and of course he shows up making the point. I have military experience. I am a person who you can count on as your military commander.
So he has the image to do it, he's got the experience, he's from Virginia. They make him the commander-in-chief, and he modestly says, I'm really not equal to the task, and I'll just do my best.
But lest some unlucky event should happen unfavorable to my reputation, I beg it may be remembered by every gentleman in the room that I this day declare with the utmost sincerity, I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with. George Washington.
His behavior seems somewhat disingenuous. Clearly, he wanted it. He was very ambitious. He was particularly ambitious in military matters.
Early on, he realizes that the best way to be ambitious is to convince everyone else that you're not ambitious. And he follows this through his entire life.
Ambitious, disingenuous, modest. Who is this man, George Washington? The man appointed to construct a new continental army. In 1775, he is hardly a household name.
He's one of the wealthiest men in the country. He's in his mid-40s and really should be in retirement at that time. Washington is someone who has nothing to gain from participation in the Revolution and everything to lose.
He wasn't born to wealth. Washington's father was a Virginia farmer who died in 1743 when George was only 11. Young George's circumstances were modest, but his dreams were big.
But he envisioned himself dancing at the grand balls in the huge homes of the rich. He envisioned himself being a great landowner, and these were dreams that he pursued constantly all of his young adult life.
As a teenager, he immerses himself in the teachings of a book called The Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior, which instructs readers on proper manners, social behavior, and temperament. He commits them to memory.
In the presence of others, sing not to yourself with a humming noise, nor drum with your fingers of feet. Lift not one eyebrow higher than the other, and bedew no man's face with your spittle by approaching too near him when you speak.
George Washington himself was very anxious to have all the right moves. He's as anxious as anyone as a teenager to get them right.
At 16, with only an elementary school education, he becomes a surveyor, where he learns how to navigate the wilderness, something that serves him well when he is appointed to the rank of major in the Virginia militia. In 1754, he leads a company of men into a territorial skirmish with French soldiers, where someone in his regiment, perhaps Washington himself, kills a French diplomat. Many believe his poor judgment starts a chain of events that leads to the French and Indian War. Despite his inauspicious start, Washington persists and eventually proves himself to be an exemplary officer. After the war, good fortune boosts Washington's ambitions. He marries a wealthy widow named Martha Custis and inherits his half-brother's estate, Mount Vernon, which he goes on to build into a plantation with more than 100 slaves. As part of the landed gentry, he goes into Virginia politics. Though he may feign unworthiness, there is no one in 1775 better equipped to take on the job of Commander-in-Chief.
Very importantly, he had been a political figure. For 16 years, he'd been a state legislator. So he was somebody who knew how to work with politicians, could work with Congress, and would not be a threat to Congress.
My dearest, it has been determined in Congress that the whole army raised for the defense of the American cause shall be put under my care.
Curiously, even when writing to Martha of his appointment, Washington is still pretending he doesn't want the job.
You may believe me when I assure you in the most solemn manner that so far from seeking this appointment, I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid it.
What he can't avoid is destiny. He takes the job for no pay and prepares to leave for Boston to take on the strongest army in the world, not yet knowing that all hell has already broken loose up there in a place called Bunker Hill. May 1775. The rebels' capture of Fort Ticonderoga turns up the pressure on the already beleaguered British commander Thomas Gage. Back in the French and Indian War, 2,000 British soldiers lost their lives seizing Fort Ticonderoga, and now Gage has lost it to the Americans. In London, King George is furious that Gage's superior forces have failed to control the colonists.
I am of the opinion that when once these rebels have felt a smart blow, they will submit. And no situation can change my fixed resolution, either to bring the colonies to a due obedience or to cast them off. King George III.
No more reasoning, no more legislating. The colonies will come to their senses or face a show of force unlike any they have ever seen. Gage is dismissed. He is too weak, too tolerant. To replace him, the British command sends its 3 best generals to bring the colonies to heel. These are England's best and brightest military men, who become known as the Triumvirate of Reputation. General Henry Clinton, American-born, a competent soldier, but socially inept, a man referred to even by himself as a shy bitch. General John Burgoyne, vain and ambitious. One popular English writer gives him the nickname Julius Caesar Burgonius. And General William Howe, an experienced military man who came to appreciate America's British colonials while fighting alongside them in the French and Indian War.
These 3 supporting generals were brought in essentially to supplant Gage, and it became a kind of personal contest between these 3 men as to who would take Gage's position as commander-in-chief in America.
Howe is the odds-on favorite, but an odd choice to take over the command in America. A political liberal, he opposes the king's policies in the colonies and had once vowed not to fight against his English countrymen there.
General William Howe was opposed to the war. All they wanted was the Americans to submit to British laws and British taxes. They didn't want to go fight them.
Boston, June 16th. In the months since Lexington and Concord, rebel militia in the hills around Boston have laid siege to the city, trapping the British and their loyalists inside. Now the British command is planning to break the rebel stranglehold with an overwhelming offensive up Bunker Hill to take the high ground around Boston. But the colonials are a step ahead of the British. Spies have slipped the British plans to the rebels. Up in the hills, regimental commanders from Connecticut and Massachusetts lead their men to fortify Bunker Hill, then decide to move 1 hill closer to Boston on Breed's Hill. There, they dig in for a British attack. Midnight, June 17th. 1,200 militiamen race the clock to beat the sunrise before it reveals their position to the British below. They must control the high ground before the enemy makes its own move. At daybreak, the sleeping British ships in Boston Harbor spot the militia positions and sound the alarm. All of Boston awakens with a start. The Patriots have beaten the British to the punch. The first full battle of the Revolution is joined. As the Redcoats assemble for battle, ships in the harbor try to pin down the militia with cannon fire. Under the command of General William Howe, lines of British soldiers, their bayonets at the ready, climb the hill without any cover. Easy targets for a man and musket that can shoot straight.
The British are convinced that they can form up in line, and despite taking casualties, instill in the Patriots fear of a professional, disciplined force of regulars, and demonstrate to the Americans that this is madness trying to oppose this army.
Twice, Howe's men charge up Breed's Hill. Twice, they are repelled by the militia. From roofs and hilltops, civilians come out to witness the bloodshed. It is war as spectator sport, but many fear for their loved ones in the fight. The rebel barrage goes on for 3 hours until they run out of ammunition. Despite their advantage, the rebels have no choice but to retreat. The British finally capture the hill on their third charge. But the ground is strewn with red-coated bodies. The new commander now realizes what no one in faraway England could possibly understand. This is not a rebellion. This is war.
When I look to the consequences of it, in the loss of so many brave officers, I do it with horror. The success is too dearly bought. British General William Howe.
The British pay a horrendous price for their victory at Breed's Hill, which erroneously but permanently becomes known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, after the original target. 1,000 of the 2,300 British soldiers, nearly half, are dead or wounded. The Americans lose 271 men out of 1,600. In defeat, the colonists have won. A paradox that over the next 6 years will come to characterize the Americans' bloody war for independence.
Bunker Hill was a defeat, of course, for these colonists. But they inflicted such heavy losses on the British that it makes them a little cocky. That was the best trained, most professional army on earth, and look at the damage we did to them. It really gives them way too much confidence.
In the days following the Battle of Bunker Hill, even as Congress begins to provide for a continental army, the delegates make one last attempt at reconciliation with Britain. They send the king what they call the Olive Branch Petition, respectfully requesting that he grant the North American colonies autonomy within the British Empire. Like all communication that crosses the Atlantic, it will take months for an answer, and General George Washington can't afford to wait to build his army. He alone holds the keys to liberty or to death. June 1775. As word of the valiant defense of Boston's Bunker Hill reaches Philadelphia, General George Washington writes a new will and heads off to meet his destiny. Whatever mortal fears Washington harbors, the people he meets on his way to Boston have no such misgivings about the man charged to defend them.
The appointment gives universal satisfaction. I was struck with General Washington. Dignity with ease and complacency, the gentleman and soldier look agreeably blended in him. Abigail Adams.
Cambridge, Massachusetts. Washington is in for a terrible surprise. Despite their brave defense of Breed's Hill, the men he is coming to command fail even his worst expectations.
He really has a task that is absolutely mind-boggling. We say that there was an army around Boston. There wasn't an army around Boston. There was a gaggle. These men are ragged, disheveled, getting drunk on duty, no knowledge of how to handle a musket efficiently. There was no discipline. There was certainly no hygiene, very little structure. It was a mess.
These are Washington's revolutionaries. This is the army he has to defend against the British Empire.
Whatever Washington may think of his soldiers as men and as citizens, as soldiers, they're not much use to him.
A dirty, mercenary spirit pervades the whole. Could I have foreseen what I have? No consideration upon earth should have induced me to accept this command. George Washington.
The general must start from scratch and personally attend to even the lowliest, most rudimentary functions.
His first tasks are fundamentally administrative tasks. His junior officers have to be taught how to fill out a report, how to count men, how to purchase supplies, how to buy tools, where to dig latrine, where to butcher meat, where to bury offal. These are all things that, amazingly enough, Washington has to concern himself with. So the task before him is immense, and it's going to require a tremendous amount of energy to literally whip this army into shape.
And the whip will come down hard. Every man will learn discipline by Washington's very strict code.
For disobedience of orders and damning his officer, to receive 30 lashes on his bare back. For expressing himself disrespectfully, to be stripped of his arms, put in a horse cart with rope round his neck, and drummed out of the army. General George Washington.
The new army is stitched together with widely different militias from very different colonies. Each is accustomed to its own command and its own way of doing things. Establishing a common culture is yet another overwhelming challenge.
There were so many different brands of fighting traditions, cultures, and people. Washington was very concerned that there were so many rivalries, so much friction between members of his army.
One of the Army's most serious problems is the utter lack of ammunition and gunpowder. When Washington is told that they have only 9 rounds of gunpowder per man, he is inconsolable. Advertisements in colonial newspapers plead for local gunmakers to step up their production, but to little avail. Perhaps no commander in history has ever faced so many obstacles to putting together a fighting force. And even if Washington succeeds, the effort may still be doomed. Most men have signed up for just 1-year enlistments.
These men are serving for very short terms. Most of them, their contracts expire either in November or December. They're only going to be around for a few months. So as soon as they become even remotely competent, they're going to go home and he's going to have a new group to train again.
Against these odds, Washington has precious little time to turn this woefully undisciplined, underprepared, and undersupplied army into a force that will have to stand up against the strongest army in the world. Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill. All the skill and experience in the world can't help British forces tame the chaos in the colonies. Thomas Gage now has only 7,000 soldiers, surrounded by Washington's 16,000.
The loss we have sustained is greater than we can bear. Small armies can't afford such losses. The rebels' number is great, so many hands have been employed. I wish this cursed place was burned. Thomas Gage.
October 11th, 1775. Without fanfare and without honors, General Thomas Gage is relieved of his command. Once Britain's most powerful man in America, he returns home alone and disgraced. General William Howe steps into Gage's boots and is already knee-deep in the American quagmire. In London, King George roundly rejects the Olive Branch Petition, Continental Congress's last grasp for peace. On October 26th, in his annual speech to Parliament, the king throws down the gauntlet.
It has now become the part of wisdom to put a speedy end to these disorders by the most decisive exertions. King George III.
What the king wants is a military solution to a political problem. But his call for war is anything but unanimous among Britain's people and politicians. But when Parliament votes, war carries the day. The military is ordered to send thousands more troops and a full armada to quell America's escalating revolution. Reinforcements can't come too soon for General William Howe. Hemmed in by the rebel siege, he and his army are virtual prisoners on the Boston Peninsula, along with 1,000 loyalists they're protecting. With no access to the countryside, they are unable to forage for food or wood. Supply ships from England have yet to arrive. The people in Boston are running out of provisions and fuel. Across the river in Cambridge, Washington is battling his own war of attrition. With the year about to come to an end, so will many enlistments, and short-timers will soon be leaving in droves. And now, Congress is pushing him to let go of some of his most loyal soldiers, African Americans. From the very beginning, free Northern blacks have been serving well the Patriot cause, with the same concerns as their white compatriots.
There was no militia unit that didn't have black men. They were at Bunker Hill, they were at Concord and Lexington and everywhere else. But recruiting black soldiers, that he had trouble with because the Continental Congress had trouble with it.
Now that the Army is a continental army, not just a local Northern one, armed blacks have created a loaded issue in Congress. Southern states are adamantly opposed to making soldiers out of them. Washington is no different from any other Southern planter regarding blacks. He sounds like the Southern slaveholder he is when he issues his order banning black recruits.
The rights of mankind and the freedom of America will have numbers sufficient to support them without resorting to such wretched assistance. George Washington.
The great irony is that the one man closest to the general is a black man, his slave, Billy Lee. For the 7 years since Washington acquired him, Lee has been his master's valet and constant companion. Washington calls him my family.
Billy Lee was more than just a slave to George Washington. He was his personal slave. Billy Lee went with him every place.
If George Washington was the best horseman in Virginia, Billy Lee was the second best. And he and Washington would horseback ride just about every day.
And so the two of them presented quite a picture that was noticed over and over by people at the time who wrote about Washington and his male servant, Billy Lee.
You could say that Billy Lee, in fact, was a close friend of George Washington, even though he was a slave.
Washington and Congress's decision to reject black soldiers plays perfectly into the enemy's hands. The royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issues a proclamation that welcomes blacks to the British side.
I do hereby declare all indentured servants, Negroes, or others that are able and willing to bear arms, free, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be. Lord Dunmore.
The Dunmore Proclamation wreaks havoc throughout Virginia. thousands of slaves flee their masters for this chance at freedom.
If you have the opportunity to throw in your lot with people who are promising you a much better situation than you have had, you'd be silly not to take that promise seriously.
It was the best opportunity for freedom they had ever seen, and they never knew whether such an opportunity would ever present itself again.
You know, Thomas Jefferson estimates that in Virginia alone, 30,000 African Americans walked off to plantations, and many of them became British soldiers.
So for the British, this is wonderful. They're not only sapping the colonial economy by depriving it of slave labor, but they've added to their fighting force.
Free blacks travel secretly from plantation to plantation to embolden slaves to escape. If they are caught, they risk death or torture. While the fight for liberty in the South threatens to blow the slave culture apart, the approaching new year threatens to dissolve Washington's Northern Army.
We are now without any money in our treasury, powder in our magazines, arms in our stores, without a brigadier, engineers, expresses. By and by, when we shall be called upon to take the field, we shall not have a tent to lie in. I have often thought how much happier I should have been if, instead of accepting a command under such circumstances, I had taken my musket upon my shoulders and entered the ranks, or had retired to the back country and lived in a wigwam. George Washington.
All seems lost, even before it's begun, until a former bookseller has an idea that will change everything. January 1st, 1776. It's a new year for a new army, and General Washington raises a new flag to commemorate it, the Grand Union, with 13 stripes representing both the differences and common cause of the 13 colonies, and with the British Union Jack in the upper left to acknowledge those colonial leaders hoping to salvage a relationship with England. That same day, the colonies get the news of the King's October Proclamation to crush the rebellion by any means necessary. It's a stunning declaration by the King that rouses rebel ire more than ever. But an army needs more than anger to fight a war. With the onset of winter, neither side has the supplies necessary to brave the cold and snow. The British hole up in Boston, waiting for reinforcements and supplies from England, while Washington uses the time to piece together an army short on everything from manpower to gunpowder. But help is on the way. Henry Knox, a 25-year-old colonel and former Boston bookseller, is leading a trek from Cambridge to Fort Ticonderoga on a quest for arms. Knox has taken it upon himself to recover the artillery captured from the British at Fort Ticonderoga. For 2 months, in the cold and wet, he, his men, and teams of oxen haul 120,000 pounds of artillery across 300 miles of muddy woods, frozen rivers, and steep, icy slopes back to headquarters in Cambridge. On January 25th, Colonel Knox delivers all of the weaponry to his commander-in-chief, miraculously intact. It is the best gift Washington could ever receive. Finally, he has the firepower he so badly needs. Washington also has in Knox a valued new commander in charge of artillery. Knox becomes part of Washington's inner circle of junior officers, whose counsel he values enormously.
George Washington always had the ability to listen to many people, particularly younger men. He thinks everybody's view is important, that it's a part of the puzzle, that people know things that he doesn't know, and if he can listen to enough opinions, he'll know as much as they do. A hallmark of good leadership.
Right away, Washington's brain trust keeps him from making a fatal mistake. As the spring thaw approaches, Washington wants to send waves of foot soldiers down into Boston in a full frontal attack. But his officers overrule him. The British are too well fortified, and the Continentals are still short of gunpowder. They do, however, have Knox's artillery. They decide to take the highest ground, Dorchester Heights, and bombard the city. March 2nd. After months of waiting, Washington and his men are more than eager to move. The general is about to launch the first offensive of his command. He sends a stern warning to his troops.
Our posterity depends upon the vigor of our exertions. If any man in action shall presume to skulk, hide himself, or retreat from the enemy without the orders of his commanding officer, he will be instantly shot down as an example of cowardice. General Washington.
The night of March 4th. Surprise will be the key. From 3 points outside the city, Cobble Hill, Lechmere, and Roxbury, the Army rains light cannon fire down on Boston. A decoy to misdirect the British, while the rest of the Army hauls Knox's artillery over to Dorchester Heights. Through the night, Washington's men build fortifications and drag cannon up the steep, frozen slope. By morning, everything is in place. Daybreak, March 5th. On the 6th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, the British awake to the sight of 20 cannon pointed down on their ships in the harbor. "My God," a shocked Howe exclaims, "these fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months."
It's not until after they see Ticonderoga's guns on Dorchester Heights that they realize they got to get the heck out of there.
The Continentals don't even need to fire a shot. Howe issues a futile order for his ship's cannon to fire on the Continental position, but Washington's guns sit just out of range. Luckily for Howe, his ships are also out of Washington's range. Howe and his army prepare to abandon the city and take thousands of Loyalist citizens with them. One Loyalist would later write,
"The necessary care of the women, sick and wounded required every assistance that could be given. It was not like the breaking up of a camp, where every man knows his duty. It was like departing your country, with your wives, your servants, your household furniture, and all your encumbrances."
Over the next 2 weeks, the Continentals watch from above as all of Boston scrambles to evacuate, taking everything with them that isn't nailed down. It is a bitter exile for the Loyalists, many of whose families had lived in Boston for generations. By March 17th, they are all gone. 120 ships carry 9,000 redcoats, 2,000 Loyalists, and as many of the city's usable goods as possible out to an unknown fate. The Patriots return to the city, the beloved birthplace of the rebellion, and Washington enjoys the first victory of his command. But it will be his last for the rest of a grueling and humiliating year. 1776 will see 33,000 British troops, the largest contingent ever sent overseas, head for America to grind the revolution into dust.
Next time on The Revolution, a tiny pamphlet provides the recruiting propaganda Washington's army desperately needs.
Common sense conjured up a vision of a very democratic America still to be.
And Continental Congress drafts a stunning declaration.
Jefferson wasn't writing anything that was revolutionary in the eyes of his own people, only in the rest of the world.
All of our founding fathers, they think they're going to hang. They are outlaws.